Welcome back to Uncensored. Dr. Gabor Mate made global headlines earlier this year when he appeared in an interview with Prince Harry. The renowned trauma expert spoke with the Duke of Sussex about the importance of healing in an interview to promote Harry's memoir. Well, more recently, Dr. Mate has been winning plaudits for his take on the Israel-Hamas war. He's an infant survivor of the Holocaust and has been outspoken about both the atrocities of October the 7th and Israel's response. And Dr. Gabor Mate joins me now. Dr. Mate, thank you very much indeed for joining me, and thank you for your patience. I know you've been sitting there listening to the interview I just conducted with this poor woman whose parents were both kidnapped. One has been returned, one hasn't yet. First of all, what was your response to that interview?
On the human level, I saw a very decent person in evident pain, in grief, obviously deep anxiety about the fate of her father. I saw somebody trying to make the best out of a really horrific situation, and my heart goes out to her.
You specialise throughout your career in trauma and helping people get through trauma. You've talked to many people who've been in extreme trauma. This is a very traumatic situation these last 2 months for people on both sides, for the people who are on the receiving end of this massacre on October the 7th. And we've just heard firsthand what that has been like for the people in Israel who suffered that. But also, of course, what's going on now in Gaza with many thousands of innocent people being killed, with Israel's military response, including thousands of children. What is your overall assessment of where this war is now heading?
For that, you need some historical context. Now, look, I used to be a Zionist. As you mentioned, I'm a Holocaust survivor. Zionism was very important for me as a salvation of the Jewish people, until I found out that the state was founded based on the extirpation, the expulsion, and multiple massacres of the local population. And that's not historically controversial. So I'm taking a longer view of this. And I'm saying that the present situation cannot be understood without looking at the historical context, and nor can we move forward if the present occupation and the suppression of the Palestinians continue. So Sharon, your previous guest, talked about the fragile coexistence. There was no coexistence. There was oppression, periodic massacres, land occupation in the West Bank, the continuous expulsion of the population from their homes. I've visited the occupied territories 3 times now. The first time, back during the first Intifada, Piers, I cried every day out for 2 weeks at what I saw. So this cannot go on. And I saw the news about the Elgin marbles being returned, and how you changed your mind about that. Well, how about returning the land that's been stolen from the Palestinians? I'm not talking about the State of Israel. I'm not talking about 1948. I'm talking about since 67 and what's going on right now. So there's got to be some stop to what's going on, and that's how I understand it. No, this is for the sake of both Israelis and Palestinians.
Yes, I completely agree with you. This is a never-ending cycle. I guess from the Israelis' point of view, what happened on October the 7th was on such a gigantically horrific scale. I do get a sense that Israel is in a collective sense of trauma, and that they are determined that Hamas should not be allowed to perpetrate such a massacre again. And they are on record, Hamas, just 2 weeks ago, their spokesman are saying they would do it again and again and again if they can. So that represents a clear existential threat to the security of people in Israel. So I guess my question for you is, what should Israel's response be? Everyone is increasingly concerned about what is going on in Gaza. Clearly, the loss of civilian life is on a catastrophic scale. Nobody thinks this is right, but at the same time, I think many would share my view that Israel has a right to defend itself. The question is, how do they do that appropriately, and how do they get rid of Hamas, if indeed you think they should get rid of Hamas?
Well, you're raising many questions, and many fair questions. Now, look, I live in Canada, where this country was founded on the suppression and the erasure of the indigenous population and the utter denial of their narrative. And in Canada, for example, there are horrendous residential schools where a few decades ago, if a native child spoke their tribal language, they'd have a pin stuck in their tongue. Now, most Canadians are not aware of that history. Most Israelis are not aware of the history of what the Palestinians have suffered. They don't know that in 1948 there were multiple massacres of large numbers of people by Israeli forces. They don't know the history, the subjective experience of the Palestinians. And in the absence of that knowledge, October 7th would just strike them as another horrific anti-Semitic event. I understand the desire for defense and certainly even a desire for revenge, but that's in the absence of knowing what the Palestinian experience has been. And the Western press, and as in all countries where the local population has been displaced, the majority of the population doesn't know the history or the subjective experience. So if you're asking me how to move forward, let's inform ourselves of the actual experience of both sides, not just one side. And just as you had this wonderful Israeli woman, Sharon here, who spoke with such humanity and such poignancy, you might have some Palestinians on explaining their experience of what it's like for them to live under occupation. And in the absence of that conversation, there's no moving forward. And that's all I'm asking for.
I've had a number of Palestinians, including a doctor.
Let me say one more thing, sorry.
Yeah.
Israel's right to defense. Yeah. Yes, Israel has the right to defend itself. Every country does. But Israel has no right to impose an occupation on people. Now look, I was born in Hungary. In 1956, when I was 13, studying for Bar Mitzvah, there was the Great Hungarian Revolution against Soviet occupation. And it was after that revolution that we became refugees and came to Canada. Now, did Russia have the right to defend itself against the Hungarian revolutionaries? You know, so, and mostly when we talk about Israel's right of defense, we're taking isolated Palestinian actions, but we're not saying that this population also has the right to defend against the occupation. I'm not justifying the terrible events of October the 7th. I'm talking in the absence of historical awareness. It all just looks like Israel defending itself. But against whom? Against a population that has been massacring in a number of thousands for 80 years and taking their lands and destroying their homes and jailing their children and torturing them. That's the history. Now, unless we know that, it all looks like this poor little country trying to defend itself. But against whom? Against people it's been occupying and displacing for 80 years. That's the history, as Israeli historians have shown. I don't make this stuff up. I wish it wasn't true. I wish I could believe in the dream of the Jewish state. I love that dream. Except I found out at what price, at what nightmare that imposed on the Palestinians.
How do you see this ever getting resolved? It seems so intractable, but then, as I always say, so did the Northern Ireland conflict. That seemed intractable when the IRA were committing terror atrocities, but they eventually did get to peace. Can you see a pathway here to peace, and what does it look like?
I can. That's a great question again. Look, you're going to have Nick Kyrgios with on later on, the tennis player. I just spent a couple of weeks in Serbia and the former Yugoslavia with another tennis player, Novak Djokovic. They have a foundation that promotes healing and child development and so on. So they asked me to speak throughout the former Yugoslavia. You know what horrific atrocities were committed there just a few decades ago. So I was in Belgrade, I was in Sarajevo, I was in Banja Luka, I was in Ljubljana. They're living together now. There are still issues to be worked out, but the minimum condition is the ending of the occupation and the inhumane siege of Gaza. And international law has to be respected. International law is very clear that this occupation is illegal. That has to be the basis of any future agreement. If that was agreed on, and if Israel could live within the borders that are internationally recognized, I believe peace is possible. Now, we keep talking about the Hamas charter. Did you know that the Likud charter, the ruling party in Israel, excludes a Palestinian entity west of the Jordan River? So let's get rid of both charters. And let's start with the basis of recognition and peace and the ending of this unspeakably brutal occupation. Piers, you have to go there to see it for yourself, as I have. And you would cry every day for 2 weeks as well.
I'm under no illusion about what the Palestinian people have had to endure, and I think the oppression of the Palestinian people for decades has been completely shameful. And it shouldn't have been happening. I mean, the mere fact that Israel was able, after October the 7th, to simply turn off the supplies of food and water and fuel and so on into Gaza says it all. That is an occupation. That is a controlling force, controlling whether people eat or have fuel or can heat themselves or feed themselves. So I'm under no illusions about that. I've been very critical of Israel before. What has complicated things for me morally with this is that the scale of what happened on October the 7th was so disgusting. And the fact that Hamas has said they will continue to try and do the same thing again is that I absolutely believe Israel has to do what it can to remove that threat. And how you do that when they are immersed in the civilian population and that population is half children without massive civilian casualties on the scale we're now seeing, I don't know. I genuinely don't know. I don't know how they resolve this. But I hope that better minds than mine can work a way through this.
Well, I hope along with you as well. But again, I'm saying that there's no possibility of that until the international community, and particularly Israel's big brothers, the UK and the US, stop supporting its illegal, brutal, inhumane, and rapacious occupation. It can't happen without some pressure. And again, most Israelis are simply not aware. I've been to Israel, talked to people. They have no idea what's happening a few miles away from when they're sitting in Tel Aviv having coffee. And they have no idea. Or in Jerusalem. And they have no idea what's happening a few miles away, how those people under occupation are living. And this has been, it's not that they're not capable of being aware, but like most people, they're just not. And I'm saying that unless we fully get the Palestinian experience historically and throughout the decades and into the present moment, we can't possibly understand what's going on here. Now, in 2005, there was a study appeared in the Journal of World Psychiatry looking at traumatized populations under war conditions. The most traumatized children in 2005, this is before Hamas gained power in Palestine and in Gaza, the most traumatized kids were in Gaza. This population has been traumatized severely. Of course they're full of rage. I'm not justifying anything they did, but I'm saying, what do we expect from this population